Hey guys, Miss Cote here, and this is video number 3 of the cell unit. In this episode, we'll continue to look at the organelles in a eukaryotic cell. As I said in the last video, you're expected to know the structure and function of these organelles and how they can work together to get their jobs done. In the previous episode, Tour of the Cell Part 1, we looked at how the nucleus and ribosomes work together to make proteins, and also how the components of the endomembrane system can pitch in to move some of those proteins to the cell membrane and beyond. So let's get started on the rest of them. The next group of organelles in the chapter deals with organelles involved with energy processes. I'm sure you can all define the mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell, but that's not going to cut it here in AP Biology. Mitochondria are where cellular respiration happens, just as chloroplasts are where photosynthesis happens. And a new organelle for you to learn is the peroxisome, and we'll get to those later. But first I need to talk to you about the origin of mitochondria and chloroplasts, because it's something important that you need to understand. It goes to the evolution of eukaryotic cells from prokaryotic cells. What cell biologists have found is that mitochondria and chloroplasts are similar to bacteria. Other than being approximately the same size as bacteria, they both have a double membrane, they both have free ribosomes within them, and they have small circular pieces of their own DNA. Another thing that was observed is that mitochondria and chloroplasts have the ability to reproduce on their own, independent from what the cell is doing at the time. These observations led scientists to come up with the endosymbiont or endosymbiotic theory, which means cell living within another cell. The endosymbiont theory suggests that once upon a time, an early ancestor of current eukaryotic cells engulfed a prokaryotic cell that used oxygen. These two cells struck up a relationship which eventually resulted in a eukaryotic cell with a mitochondrion. So this cell now had the ability to perform aerobic respiration. And at least one of these cells also engulfed a photosynthetic prokaryotic cell, which eventually became a chloroplast. And this cell now had the ability to also perform photosynthesis. We'll discuss this again in the evolution unit when we look at the history of life on Earth. But know that College Board likes this endosymbiotic theory, so I would probably be familiar with how this works and the evidence that supports it. Mitochondria are the organelles where cellular respiration takes place. They're responsible for breaking down organic molecules like glucose and converting the stored energy into ATP, which is energy that the cell can use. Mitochondria are present in pretty much all eukaryotic cells, and I'm saying pretty much because there are always exceptions to the rule. And the number of mitochondria that a cell has will correlate with its metabolic activity, meaning active cells will have a lot of mitochondria, like muscle cells. I want to use the diagram on the next slide to go over the vocabulary, so you can always pause this slide to write everything down. Here we have a model of a mitochondrion, which is the singular form. The outer of the two membranes is the smooth outer covering. The inner membrane, however, has folds in it. These folds are called cristae. Remember what I said about seeing folds in projections? This is to increase the surface area to increase the efficiency of cellular respiration, connecting structure to function. This separates the mitochondria into two different compartments. The space between the outer and inner membranes is called the intermembrane space, inter meaning between, so between the membranes. The space inside the inner membrane is called the matrix, not to be confused with the movies. The matrix is where you can find some free ribosomes and small pieces of circular DNA. This creates structural proteins and enzymes involved in cellular respiration. We're obviously going to go over cellular respiration in a lot more detail in the energy unit. Next, we have the chloroplasts, the organelles found only in plants and some algae. Chloroplasts contain a very important pigment called chlorophyll and are responsible for converting energy from the sun into energy stored in organic molecules. And like with the mitochondria, I want to use the model on the next slide to go over the vocabulary. Like the mitochondria, A chloroplast has two membranes, an inner and an outer membrane, that breaks up the chloroplast into two separate spaces. Inside the inner membrane is a fluid called the stroma. This is where the ribosomes and circular DNA are found, along with another network of membranes. These membranes form stacks of flattened discs. Each disc is called a thylakoid, and a stack of discs is called a granum. The plural is grana. This produces yet another compartment inside the chloroplast. We'll be going over photosynthesis in more detail in the energy unit as well. A new organelle that you guys have probably never heard of is the peroxisome. Structurally, they're very similar to lysosomes in the fact that they're a vesicle filled with enzymes. However, the enzymes in peroxisomes are used for oxidation reactions, removing a hydrogen atom from molecules and transferring it to produce hydrogen peroxide. Eventually, the hydrogen peroxide will be converted to water. Remember the catalase reactions we did in the enzyme lab. We don't go into too much detail about peroxisomes, but I would know the basics just in case. The next section is about the cytoskeleton, a network of structures that shape and support the cell. The three types of structures are the microtubules, which are the thickest fibers, microfilaments, which are the thinnest fibers, and intermediate filaments. Guess what? Those are the ones in the middle. Please don't feel that you need to memorize everything in this section. A lot of what you'll need to know will come up again in other sections of the course. For now, I'm going to quickly go through some of the important stuff. In addition to helping support and shape the cell, another important function of the cytoskeleton is to help with cell motility. Cell motility can mean two things. First, the whole cell itself can move from place to place, using structures like cilia and flagella. Or second, organelles and vesicles inside the cell can move around. One misconception to address here is that organelles and vesicles don't just move around the cell by floating wherever they want to. Their movement is accomplished by being pulled along tracks of the cytoskeleton by really cool proteins called motor proteins. I'll have to show you some videos in class of how these motor proteins work. But right now, let's take a quick look at what the three cytoskeleton components are responsible for. Microtubules are the thickest components of the cytoskeleton. Don't worry about the measurements. The major functions of the microtubules are for the shaping of the cell, providing tracks to move the organelles around the cell, and separating chromosomes during cell division. Structures of the cell that contain microtubules that we'll discuss during the course would be the centrosomes and centrioles. These structures are important during mitosis and meiosis. Microtubules, called spindle fibers, will elongate from the centrosomes and they separate the chromosomes. And we'll look more at these structures when we get to cell division. Microtubules are also involved with flagella and cilia. Remember, flagella are the long hair-like structures that propel cells, such as the tail of sperm. Cilia are the shorter, more numerous hairs that can also be used for movement for unicellular organisms. Or cilia can line passages, such as our trachea, to sweep and trap debris from entering the lungs. I know the book spends time discussing more detailed structure of cilia and flagella, but don't worry about the details. It's not important for what you need to know. The next piece of the cytoskeleton are the microfilaments, the thinnest fibers. They're also known as actin filaments. They have many roles in the support of the cell, but the major ones would be working with myosin filaments for muscle contraction, the movement of amoebas by cellular extensions called pseudopods, and cytoplasmic streaming, the circular flow of cytoplasm and materials in plant cells. Actin filaments are also important in a process called cytokinesis, the separation of daughter cells after cell division. A structure called the cleavage furrow is formed by actin filaments pinching in to separate the cells. The last piece of the cytoskeleton are the intermediate filaments. They have a diameter in between microtubules and microfilaments. And while the other two fibers are able to be made and broken down all around the cell, the intermediate filaments are permanent. And this brings us to the last section of the chapter, which discusses the extracellular structures of the cell along with some various connections between cells. One extracellular structure that you should already be familiar with is the cell wall. You guys learned to use the presence of a cell wall to distinguish a plant cell from an animal cell. The cell wall of plants is made of cellulose, and its job is to protect and support the plant cell. But also know that other organisms, such as bacteria, fungi, and some protists, can also have cell walls. Their cell walls have different compositions. Cell walls in bacteria are made up of a combination of proteins and carbohydrates, and the cell walls of fungi are made up of chitin. Remember that structure? It's a polysaccharide you learned about in the biochemistry unit. Here's a diagram of plant cells surrounded by cell walls. Please don't worry about these terms in the box. You're probably never going to need to use these terms this year. Just basically know the structure and function of a cell wall. Obviously, animal cells do not have a cell wall, but I don't want you to think that the outside surface of an animal cell is nice and smooth, perhaps like models you've seen in the past. They do have a bunch of stuff happening outside of the cell, and we refer to this collectively as the extracellular matrix, or the ECM. Please don't worry about memorizing all of these other words in bold, not important for what you need to know right now. If these words come up later on, then we'll deal with it later on. And here's a sample of what the outside of an animal cell looks like. There are obviously proteins that span the membrane, but there are also protein fibers, sometimes along with carbohydrates attached. We'll see examples during the year of how the outside of the cell contributes to the overall functioning of the cell. The last thing I want to mention in this episode are the cell junctions. These are connections between cells that allow cells to communicate or share materials with each other. There are two of these junctions that you should know about since they'll come up again during the course. The connections between plant cells are called plasmodesmata. Remember, while the cell wall provides support and protection, it also makes it hard to get materials into the cell when there's a wall in the way. So these channels that go through the cell wall and connect two cells together allows materials to diffuse from one cell to the next. In animals, channels between cells are called gap junctions. You'll probably see the other two terms at some point later, but don't worry about them now. College Board loves to ask questions about which cells these connections are found in, so it's a good idea to know these. Looking at the diagram, there are many ways that cells can be attached to each other, but like plasmodesmata, gap junctions are how two cells that are adjacent to each other can share or give materials to the other one. And that finally finishes the chapter on parts of the cell. Just understand that in order to work properly, all of the structures and organelles in the cell need to work properly and together in order for the cell to function. Think about it. If an organ in your body wasn't working properly, you're not going to work properly. Same with the cell and its little organs. So as always, if you have any questions, please remember to ask them at the beginning of class. And until the next time I see you, be a good human.